Get off the marketing roller coaster and get on the automated fast track to digitally market your brand everywhere now. Join podcast producer Tom Hazard and Inc. columnist Tracy Hazard as they share easy content-building formulas and smart cut secrets proven to fuel hundreds of blogs, podcasts, and brands with bingeable original content. Join the conversation on how to get your message out to the world. Be original. Be heard. Promote with power and purpose. Feed your brand.
Hey everyone, this is Tracy and Tom on the Feed Your Brand podcast, and we are going to talk something a little bit controversial today.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I enjoy this debate, and I do think it's a debatable subject, although I think we're right about it. But it's a debatable subject.
So we're going to talk whether you should be a best-selling author or be a podcast host, or both. It's okay too. But
yeah, both is okay
both
too.
Is okay
although
too.
I would say you should be a podcast host
But which
first.
one has more authority?
Right.
Does podcast host authority weigh heavier than a best-selling author authority? I'd say right now, where we're standing and what we're hearing from booking agents, event promoters, and all of that, and if you check out just the late night guests, like the list of all the late night guests on political shows, just your regular late night shows, the number of podcast hosts who are being featured by all kinds of
that are being interviewed by Stephen Colbert, by Jimmy Fallon, and
Bill
other
Maher.
late night shows, they are increasing in frequency and popularity tremendously.
Right. And that's on both sides of the aisle. We're not taking any.
Yeah, it's not a political statement.
Right.
It's
increasing all around. The same thing is happening in events. And we hear people who are podcast hosts being sought after speakers for events all around. That's one of the things that we get that coming back a lot, that it's actually really easy. So a lot easier to be a podcast host and get an event invitation than it is to just be a best-selling author. And so I want to talk a little bit about why that is, I think.
Yeah, I think we all could agree, or at least admit, that being a best-selling author today is a lot easier to achieve if you've got the money to pay for it. There are ways to game that system and be on the New York Times best-selling author list.
Well, they've made it more difficult. And so just kind of like Amazon has done on the Amazon seller side of like reversing the reviews and other things. So New York Times has done something similar. So they just changed their complete algorithm. I have been invited to hear Michael Drew, author of Pendulum, and I mean, that's pretty amazing. But he's done like 100 New York Times bestsellers in a row. Like, it's an amazing amount of New York Times bestsellers.
He's not the author.
He's not the author. He represents authors
Right.
to go into that. So he's like the top agent to be able to get people to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And they have just changed their algorithm and made it incredibly difficult. And they still are able to do that. They still have been able to do that. So it's a combination of who they choose, right? Because they know that they can achieve it and get ahead of it. Because what they have is a platform underneath them. That is the big difference, because the New York Times algorithm is also checking to see not just who you are as the author. Do you have a lot of listeners? Do you have a lot of viewers? Do you have a lot of readers already? But they're then checking and cross-checking that against real social profiles. So they're making sure that those people who are buying the books and reviewing the books as a part of their algorithm actually exist. Now, Amazon was easier because they were in control of that. You have verified buyers, verified
purchasers. Yeah.
So when they skew heavily to that, they can do that as well. But there's still ways to game the system and end up in Amazon because of the categories. So you can be the bestseller in a category that only needs you to sell 10 books in a day to outrank the top seller. So, because they have so many categories.
Sure. So, I mean, to me, and obviously I'm just one person, it's just my opinion, but it means less to me when someone says they're a best-selling author. I mean, if you're a real best-selling author, and I know of you because you're really a prolific author like a Malcolm Gladwell, yeah, of course, you're a best-selling author, and I've read a bunch of your books, and they're fantastic. But if I've never heard of you before, or your subject, and you're a best-selling author, that best-selling author tagline or qualifier doesn't mean as much to me.
Right. And so that's really where you hear it all the time. It's a glorified business card nowadays. Right. A book is a glorified business card. Now, actually, Tom and I have not put out our books. We have been doing
absolutely.
this a long time, and I get invited to events. I'm speaking at like 6 events in the next 8 weeks. So we get invitations all the time. And why is that? Because there's a significant difference in weight to podcast hosts. When you hear that we have a show that has 480 episodes and we have 100,000 listeners or downloads or plays, whatever that is, even if you don't believe that statistic of 100,000, like that people actually listen to all of it.
Which is a monthly stat, by the way.
Right, it's a monthly stat. And so even if you say, okay, well, 100,000, well, she's still got to have like 10,000 listeners, right? You still got to have...
Even if they're all listening to like multiple episodes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You still got to have a lot of listeners. And if we can command that in what's happening in our case in a bingeable way, right? Because people listen to many episodes at a time or in a month. When you have that and you can carry an audience for that long a period of time, it says 3 things about you. You must be entertaining or edutaining, right? You must be delivering good value or people wouldn't stick around, right? And the third thing is you can command an audience. You have audience authority. So all of those things are what event promoters want, right? You must know how to promote yourself because you've gotten yourself that audience because iTunes didn't give it to you. Stitcher didn't give them to you, right? We have to seek our own audiences as podcast hosts. So all of those things hold a very high value with event promoters nowadays. They know that. And they can also just really easily, much different than picking up a book and looking at it, right? They can see how articulate are you going to be on their show? How easily can you speak on the fly? Are you going to be able to answer questions? How good are you at what you do in an event situation? So it bodes much higher speaker profiles.
I agree 100% because a lot of people, let's face it, who write books today don't actually write themselves or write them all themselves, like the hard way, the old school way, right? And oftentimes it's either a ghostwriter or they're recording their book and somebody's prompting them with questions to try to pull the information out of them. So I dare to say you can fake it being an author and not necessarily be a writer, but as a podcast host, creating an audio show, you're you behind that microphone. People are going to hear you and know you, and you can either do it or you can't. That corresponds to being able to speak from the stage or not quite often.
Right. So in our minds, it's like, well, I think that being a best-selling author is wonderful and good for you and congratulations, but it's not enough nowadays. It's
Right.
not enough. Everyone is a best-selling author. I've met thousands of them, literally. The last 3 years alone, I've met thousands of best-selling authors, and I can tell you that and I read a lot, that there's not maybe 2% that I've read their books.
Well, and that's the other point I want to make, Tracy, I was just thinking about as well, is that I would bet that the majority of people who bought the books, or not even
them
bought,
or
doesn't
bought them?
even matter
Yeah.
if you bought it, who are in possession of those books, I think that a smaller percentage of those people have actually read that book or read it in its entirety. Now, contrast that with the 100,000 downloads of the podcast episodes of ours in a given month. I guarantee you that all those downloads, the vast majority of them were actually listened to because people want to listen to these things. They want to hear what you have to say. And quite honestly, it's a lot easier for them to listen to it, especially while they have busy lives, while they're commuting, or even while they're at work having lunch or something.
Washing dishes.
Yeah, that you can listen to it. Heck, you can say to your Amazon Echo, hey, Alexa, play me the Feed Your Brand podcast. It'll play you the latest episode.
You can really do that, by the way, if
No,
you guys
that's
are
legit.
interested. Yeah, go ahead and do it.
And every one of our clients who has a podcast is also available over the Amazon Alexa. That's one of the platforms that we put you on. And it's very powerful. So
we also put you on Google Play. So that means Hey Google would play you as well, by the way.
Yes.
So you can do that on Hey Google if you're a Hey Google person. We have to be an Amazon Alexa household.
We definitely are.
Although we may have to change her name because our Alexandra is home too often. It's getting confused.
Yeah, Alexa does mistake one of her kids' names for her own name at times. But anyway, take the good with the bad.
So the point is that really that we are getting this author versus host kind of dynamic going on. And reality is that what we're seeing is a much higher elevation and a much quicker adoption of podcast hosts as having authority. So podcast host authority translating into speaking engagements, into getting more stages, into getting more. And in a sense, if you are already an author then and a podcast host, getting more books sold.
Yeah, and in fact, if you are an author first and either are not a podcast host or maybe have become one, I would argue that taking your book and breaking its chapters down into short subjects and making a podcast out of every one of them is going to be much more effective for you than just putting your book out there.
Please don't read your book, though.
No,
Please do not do that.
It. No.
Yeah. We just use the same topic and then talk off the cuff about it. Expand on things you couldn't put in the book on, the things that your editor would have cut out that you should have cut out, right?
Or tell stories that are in it or about it, but tell them, don't read them. Don't be
Please.
like, what did we hear? Hillary Clinton reading her own book for the audiobook thing. And
yeah, we
it's
mentioned
just
that already on the show.
Not very effective.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely don't do that. I just want to mention that we actually have many of our podcasters, and we actually ourselves are producing books from our podcasts. That is a very common occurrence here. So we're actually in the midst of building 3 books at once. So we've done 0 books up until this point, and we're doing 3 books all at one time. We're doing a book that came from my column. So it came completely from my column. So all the articles are being repurposed into a book, and they're being sectioned into a way that makes a lot of sense for the way that I talk about innovation.
But that has nothing to do with a podcast.
But that has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
But what I did was I took interviews that I did that along the way, because I recorded them and transcribed them. So even though I didn't use them in a podcast, which I could have, but I didn't, but I have those, and I turn them into secondary chapters within each of them. So there's like these asides about the interview subject that was written about in the article. So I've created that, and I created that completely from an interview and then the transcription from that, which you have if you're guesting, if you have guest interview on your podcast. So you have something like that, and you can use them in conjunction with the stories or whatever the main topic is. So that's like a great way to interject your podcast into a book. Another way is we're taking some of our top episodes out of our 3D printing podcast. We're taking our top episodes and we're organizing them into a way that makes sort of almost like a how to 3D print kind of book. So that's one of the ones that we're in the works on. I think we're probably going to have to add a lot of additional content because there's a lot of visuals required. So it's a little bit of a different book. So we definitely have to supplement that one. And then reality is that the Product Launch Hazards podcast that we are doing for our private clients, that has turned into a book in and of itself. And that one was just actually turned into a book and a course all at once.
Yeah, so I think there's so much more power in speaking your content and being able to get so much more return for the time you invest in creating it and putting it out there in multiple different ways. It's just so much easier to convert it and get more out of it than it is to get as much out of a book. Plus, the process is so much faster.
Right. And if you are an author, like if you're an author that really needs to appeal to its fans, the podcast is a great way to keep that fan base going in between books. And I think that that's something that you really have to understand is like sort of that die off of they're not getting notified anymore and that's not happening. And so being able to keep that fan base going, I mean, that's one of the reasons Malcolm Gladwell did his little interjection of his revisionist podcast, and it really gave him such a great little boost in fan base audience. And then he is on his way to launching his next book, which should be coming out, I don't know when, maybe early next year or something like that, I had heard. Anyway, so the podcast gave him more fans. I mean, isn't that amazing?
Sure. Well, you engage with an audience on a different level, and they get to know you better hearing you. They think they know you. It's emotionally you're connecting with an audience in a different way and in a more meaningful way.
You
It's
say
so hard
that
to
like
explain.
you're not a reader, and I'm a reader. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I think a really powerful book connects to you like that, and I expect that from a book. But when
But
you
it's
have,
different, though,
But it's
isn't it?
different
Yes.
because it's a one-time interaction. It's not a continual interaction, and I think that that's really where the podcast host authority is translating into more speaking gigs, more interviews, more press interviews, more articles written about you. And so, if that's your goal, and that's what this podcast is all about, Feed Your Brand is about being that kind of brand authority, right? You being the brand casting you. And so we want you to have that constant authority. And so it needs to be something that's driving that all along the way. And so while I would say if you have a choice between starting a podcast or writing a book, start the podcast. It will help you write the book, but it will also give you authority to be able to pitch that book later.
Yeah, authority, not just authority. It gives you a lot more reach to be able to push that book later, promote that book later. It's just more people are going to know about it because you've already got an audience who wants to hear what you have to say. You tell them you have a book, you're going to move a lot more books than you would if you didn't have a podcast.
Exactly. So anyway, yeah, it's a sort of versus because we're saying that because we know it's a little controversial out there because best-selling authors love their best-selling author title, and I don't blame them. I'd be proud of it too. And many of our clients have found that podcast host title is very powerful right now. And you should use every bit of authority you can get in this marketplace to be heard, be seen, be invited, and then be sold, right? So have those books sold.
Well, but you may not agree with us, and that's okay. We can have that discussion. I invite you to come to the blog post at brandcastingu.com, and you can leave a comment down at the bottom of this post.
Right? Or on the Facebook page, Feed Your Brand.
Absolutely. So, hey, let's keep talking about it, and that'll be a fun conversation. So thanks for listening, everybody. This has been Tom and Tracy
on the Feed Your Brand podcast.